Well, Dale, it's so great to have you joining me on the podcast. Thanks for being here.
Well, thanks for the opportunity. Looking forward to our conversation today.
I'm really looking forward to this too because, as I mentioned, off air just a second ago, this is a nuance that we haven't talked about a whole lot. And I'm kind of scratching my head as to why, because this is a very real pain point. Job loss, unemployment. This is something that people are really battling with, especially nowadays. And I don't know why we haven't touched on this. So I appreciate you coming in and being a part of this conversation.
Thanks. And Davey, it's because one of the challenges is the unemployed don't like to talk about it. They don't like to tell people they're unemployed. They deal with a lot of emotions, shame, embarrassment. And so talking about it is not easy for them. And that's why it just doesn't raise to the issues of some other things that seem to be easier for people to talk about.
Yeah, I think that's very true. There are certain things that we go through, and it can be so tied up in who we believe that we are, in our identity. And I think that the American culture propagates this idea that you are what you do. Your net worth really determines your self-worth, right? That's what often the American culture we can get caught up and swept up in that. And so I imagine that this is one of those topics that, man, people just they don't even want to admit, okay, this is where I'm struggling and this is the season I'm in.
Absolutely.
Well, you've written this devotional called How Long, Oh Lord, How Long? And I love the topic of this. We're going to dive into your story in a second, and then we'll talk about some of the things that God taught you through some seasons of job loss and unemployment. But I think what I really love about this is I love looking at some of these waiting seasons and not wasting the waiting season. And often with job loss and unemployment, you find yourself in this waiting season where you have some sense of feeling out of control, and yet God wants to do something to repurpose those seasons as well. And so we're going to dive into all of that based on what you've experienced and what you've learned. And so why don't you go back and just tell us a little bit about kind of the beginning of your journey and why this became such a deep passion and holy discontent for you.
Well, Davey, I want to take you back to February of 2003. At that point in time in my career, my background has been in human resources. So I was an executive. I was the head of human resources for a large metropolitan hospital. We were actually the third largest in the St. Louis area at that particular point in time. We had a new chief operating officer who was on board. And one of the things that he had talked to our leadership team about was a need to begin to reduce the number of employees that we had, that he didn't believe we could sustain things with the labor costs that we were. And ultimately, the organization had made a decision that we were going to start eliminating some jobs. And as a leadership team, we felt, as difficult as it was, it really needed to start with the leaders, not the rank and file. And we had made a decision that we were going to eliminate 25 leadership positions the following week. Now, some other things in context of where that was, this was really kind of my dream job. Yeah. I came out of college with that as a degree, worked my way up through the ranks to this position. So this was a pretty significant one for me. I grew up in that hospital in terms of that's where I really learned my profession and everything else. I have three sons at that point in time. Two of them were in college. One of them was in a private high school. We like to refer to those as the heavy cash flow years. And I had really three responsibilities for my job at that point in time. And one was, how do I prepare 25 leaders in our organization to have a tough conversation? So how do I prepare them to talk to somebody that they probably hired, they've developed on their team, and they're going to walk in the door the following Monday, and they're going to get the word that, you've done nothing wrong, but you don't have a job. So that was number one. The second responsibility was, how do we prepare to support 25 people who walked in the door and got a message that is, no matter what they've done, they don't have a job.
Wow.
And
Yeah.
the third was, how do we help an organization? And again, we had over 4,000 employees. We probably had about 1,000 on the medical and dental staff, and then volunteers. So when you added it all up, it's a pretty large community. How do we help people understand, well, what does this mean? Because when they hear one thing, the first question is, well, what does this mean for me? How does this impact my life? And I was having a conversation with our chief operating officer, and I was reviewing the plans with him. So I was kind of walking through, here's how we're going to do all these things that are on my plate. And at the end of it, he really thanked me. He said, looks like it's really good, got everything done that we need done. And he got up, but he didn't leave. He stood behind his chair and he paused, which was really odd. And, I recognized it later, and he just looked at me and he said, 6 little words that forever changed my life. He said, your name is on the list. 6 little words ended 25 years of my career and made me unemployed for the first time in my life. And it was a shock. Not that I didn't think that I could ever lose a job. I mean, part of being in senior leadership is you understand that sometimes you can lose a job.
Yeah.
I think what surprised me was this COO was really big into the metrics, the measurement tools, and my division was in the top 10% of everything that we measured. So I became unemployed, and it's not that I didn't know how to look for a job. So I was blessed with, first of all, an outgoing personality that makes some things a little bit easier. I'm not an introvert, I'm an extrovert. But I understand about resumes. I understand about job search.
Yeah.
The part that really got to me as I was on the journey was the emotional side. And so I went and looked for my book, and it didn't exist. And so in that period of time, as I was wrestling with what's next, I actually began to do a little bit of writing, trying to put some thoughts down on paper that might be able to help somebody else. And probably about 11 months into the journey, I started my own consulting practice, and that took off and life seemed good. And 5 years into that, one of my clients hired me. And 10 years later, I went and had breakfast with my boss who had the same story. That was, thanks for all that you're doing, but we've decided to restructure and eliminate your job. And it was at that point in time that I said, I've got to give something back to all the people that go through this, because I know there are a lot of people going through it. And that was the genesis for me to write the book and try and help people understand the emotional side. So I always tell people, this isn't a book that helps you find a job. It's a book that helps you navigate that period of time when you feel lost, out of control. Dealing with emotions that you never wanted to deal with or you even understand.
Yeah. Man. What kind of comes to mind as I'm hearing you say this is, first of all, I think of it from the standpoint of a leader who has a team, who cares about his team. And, I can't imagine what it was like to put all this work together. Already you're dealing with the emotions of going, man, how do we help these folks who are going to find themselves jobless tomorrow? You care about them. And then in one fell swoop to realize, and to hear your name's on this list. Thanks for all the preparation that you've done to help to take care of this stuff. And oh, by the way, now you're also going to be without a job. And so I imagine there was so many just complicated emotions there, among other things, probably not feeling cared for, which I understand. There's that corporate side of things that, all of this kind of nuance within the whole thing. But can you just kind of, illuminate to us what was it that you were experiencing? What were you feeling? Those emotions you said that you didn't know how to wrestle with those because they became so overwhelming. Now I'm sure you've been able to start putting some language to that, obviously, because you've written this book to help other people begin to put language to it. But can you illuminate that for us? What was that like?
So Dave, you're the first person that's really been astute enough to pick up on that issue about my own team. that was a really hard one for me. I actually had the option to stay and go through this process with everybody and then leave at the end of the following week, or I could have walked out the door that day, and I chose to stay for the next week. And so that was really kind of a hard thing to be walking through it and thinking about my team. So in many ways, you feel like a failure. So you feel like a failure that, wait a second, I've lost a job. I've done something wrong here. Therefore, I've failed. And then it's also, I've failed the team. I've got a group of people that I've cared for, mentored, and developed, and I'm not going to be there for what's coming next because there's more coming. When this was just the first step in a really change in an organization, and I wasn't going to be around to help them. So first of all, it was, yes, I'm a failure personally because I've lost a job. I'm a failure because as part of this process, I've let my team down and I can't be there to care for them. And then the other one that hit me, and it really began to hit me as I physically left the place, was recognizing how much of my identity was really tied up into what I did and who I was. And then all of a sudden I was out of job. So I wasn't that person. And that was really hard because that's who I was. I mean, again, this was a dream job for me. I had worked my way to that. And we so often, Dave, think life is linear. If I do the right things, the next good thing will happen. If I don't do wrong things, the things won't happen. And so when all of a sudden life throws you the curveball, you're sitting there saying, well, God, what happened here? And for me particular, it was loss of who I was.
Dale, that's so true. And I don't know if this is necessarily everybody's personality, but I know I resonate with that 100%. And the idea that if I do the right things, if I just do the right things, then everything's going to work out for me. Right. And so maybe there's a mixture of naivety or just, even like trust, and thinking that God's going to make sure that I'm taken care of if I do the right things. That can begin to creep into your mindset. And yet you're telling us of an experience where that wasn't the case. You're going, I did all the right things. And even, I'm admiring the nobility that you walked in by sticking around for that week, as difficult as that must have been, just to make sure due diligence was done and make sure all the T's were crossed and the I's were dotted. And yet you then find yourself in a season where it's like, I did all the right things, and yet here I am. This is what happened.
Yeah, and that happens to a lot of people in this country. And for me, the emotional side of not knowing who I was really impacted me when I went to introduce myself to people. So I was so used to saying, hi, I'm Dale Kreienkamp. I'm the head of human resources because when you meet new people, they immediately say, well, what do you do? And unfortunately, the first thing we don't do is we don't lead with what's most important. So if I led with what was most important, I'd say, hey, I'm blessed. I've been married to Deb for however many years it was at that particular point in time, which back then it was 30 plus years. Today it's almost 45. And I would talk about my kids. And today I get to talk about my grandkids. But that's not usually how we lead. We usually lead with our vocation.
Wow.
And so when that vocation is gone, it's like, well, how do I really say what I'm all about? That becomes really hard for people. And then there's a belief that people don't really understand what you're going through. And part of that is true because most people don't really get and understand job loss. And yet there are a lot of people that have been through it. And there are people that do understand it, and they really do get it.
Yeah, that's so true. It's funny. We talk about this sometimes on the podcast. We have this course called the Pain to Purpose course, where we talk about the idea of Sabbath rest and how that returns us back to our identity in Christ, rather than, the Sabbath was established for the Israelite people because they were coming out of Egypt, where they were slaves. Their identity was in what they do, what they produce, right? And they were forced into this to perform and to produce. And so God wanted to kind of extract that identity from them. And so he wanders them around in the wilderness for 40 years, teaching them how to be sons, going from slaves to sons, changing their identity of who they were collectively as a people, but also individually. And what's interesting is that was a waiting season, right? A season in between this old mentality and the new one in the promised land. And it seems like that's so much of how God orchestrates some of these refinement, sanctification seasons for us, is these waiting type seasons, right? Like almost like a forced Sabbath in some ways is what you're describing when it came to your unemployment.
Absolutely. And I'm a type A personality, Davey. So it was really hard. I was used to going constant. That's what I did. And looking to the future. So we had plans for the next year. We had plans for the next 2 or 3 years. Looking to the future, moving, not just things with my family outside of work, but work was a significant issue. And we in America sometimes brag too much about the hours we work. So did I work a lot of hours? Yes. But I think sometimes we misstate what all those are. But it was a pretty significant commitment. All of a sudden, it wasn't there. It's like, how do you fill that void? Because I'm not used to sitting still. And this was a time when he wanted me to sit still. And I didn't like that.
Yeah, I bet. I don't like sitting still either. So, let's say someone's found themselves in that season right now, right? They're in like the immediate aftermath. They're tuning this in. They've just lost their job this past Friday, right? It always seems like a Friday, doesn't it? And I'm sure you know all the reasons why, being from an HR background, but Friday comes and they've just lost their job. They're now in the immediate aftermath of this. Looking back on it, what can you tell us you would do if you have that perspective in the immediate aftermath of a job loss?
I think I would say to them that relax, it's going to be okay. This is a when process, not an if process. And when we lose our job, we immediately start spiraling a little bit mentally out of control, wondering, gosh, will I lose my house? Will I ever find another job? Will I have to move? I mean, you begin to try and fill your head with some type of answers to questions you don't have the answer to.
Yeah.
And so I would say to anybody that's lost the job, it's going to be okay. It's when. And that's not to say you're not going to have some ups and downs, but God's going to be with you and you're going to learn more. So the interesting thing is, Dave, I don't know that I've ever had anybody that I've met over a cup of coffee, a conversation about the book or whatever, who said, yeah, I lost my job and it was the worst thing for me. They don't say that. Because when they get out of the barrel and they find out what's next, they usually say, my gosh, I am enjoying this more than I ever thought I would in my life. I'm having more fun. I'm learning. I'm growing. As I look back, this was the best thing for me. That's what people end up telling me. And it's consistent. It just over and over again. But that doesn't mean it's easy when it's happened. For those people, it's really hard.
Right.
And I think, Dave, we don't understand how big unemployment is in the country. If I may just share a couple numbers to help put it in perspective. So every year in this country, so let's go pre-pandemic. So let's take a look at the decade from that ends in 2019. All right. In that 10-year period of time, every year, through a layoff, a job elimination, a discharge, on average, 21.7 million job losses every year for that decade. Now, let's put 21.7 million into perspective. In this country, every year, about probably 2.8 million people die, which is like the size of the city of Chicago. I think about 1.7 million diagnosed with cancer. It's probably the size of everybody that lives in Phoenix. Um, Divorces, there's probably about 800 or 900,000 divorces, which is maybe the size of Fort Worth, Texas. New diagnosis of Alzheimer's, 500,000. That's like Kansas City. So 21.7 million. I'm in Missouri. I have to take every man, woman, and child in Missouri, add the state of Illinois, and add the state of Kansas to get to 21.7. And that's happening every year. So the numbers are significant. So the reaction of someone who's lost a job, though, is there's nobody like me. I'm all alone. Well, you're not alone. You got 21.7 million people that are going through a similar thing with you. But it's just really hard for people because they don't even like to talk about it.
Yep.
Which is one of the challenges.
Man, that's staggering, Dale. I had no idea that many people in a given year will lose their job.
Wow. So we as an economy just shed jobs when the expense is too much, and then we say we're going to go hire them, which, when you keep doing that, people wonder why we see the Great Resignation today.
Yeah.
People have just watched it and said, look, you really don't care that much about me.
Yeah.
And so it's the generation of kids today that have watched what happened to mom and dad that are reacting, saying, I think there's something else for me, and I'd rather be the one in control.
Yeah. Yeah, that makes a lot of sense as you kind of survey the landscape of what's happening with, obviously technology avails to us the ability to start businesses and, kind of become more entrepreneurial, but it feels like there's a lot more people who are doing that route than ever before. 15, 20 years ago, you didn't see this many people who were getting out, starting online businesses and, doing those kinds of things. And so that makes a lot of sense that is the result of kind of a reactionary generation in a lot of ways.
Yeah. If you watch mom or dad be faithful and work hard, and then all of a sudden somebody comes in and says, thanks for the memories, you're saying, I don't think I want that to happen to me. I want to control that. And one of the ways we at least feel like we're in control is we do our own business. Now, there's still a lot of things that are out of control, but at least you feel like you're the one who's, making the decisions. I read a statistic one time about the number of hours people worked corporately and entrepreneurs. And entrepreneurs work more hours than people in the corporate setting, but they have more fulfillment because they at least feel like it's going towards something that they have some investment in. Yeah,
there's a sense of agency, right? There's a sense of I can control my future. I have say into my destiny. When you're doing that, it's one of, this is a little bit off topic, but it's one of the things that draws me to it. I've always been entrepreneurial. My wife jokes around. She said, have you ever had a W-2 job? I said, yeah, when I started the church that we started. That was my only W-2 job that I ever had. But, it's one of those things where in trauma, that's the first thing that we end up losing is our sense of agency. We have this spiraling of going, whoa, I'm out of control. And then there's a battle to try to figure out how much control do I have and how much do I really not have? And I think that's a spiritual battle, right? Because I think that's where the interplay of faith and trust as well as obedience begins to intersect. Can you talk about that a little bit? To what degree in a season of waiting like this, are we supposed to kind of just go, well, you know what, Lord, I trust your plan and I'm going to walk in this. When does that mindset begin to creep into apathy? And then when does the whole other side of the spectrum where it's like, well, I got to make something happen. I got to, and where does that begin to fail to steward or recognize the season that God has brought you into? There's a tension between the two. Can you dialogue about that with me?
Davey, there's a huge conflict that goes on. So when you're unemployed, you all of a sudden realize you have something you've never had before, which is time. And immediately everybody says, well, you have to work as many hours to find a job as you were working in whatever you were doing as a vocation. Doesn't matter whether you were a carpenter or an executive, you go do that to try and find a job.
Yeah.
The reality is there's only so many hours a day you can really focus on job search. So you do have extra time. And so you begin to say, well, can I enjoy some things that I've never had time to enjoy? And then when you're doing them, you feel like, well, gosh, I'm probably missing the one job that got posted while I'm doing whatever it was. So there's a constant conflict about time for people. Yeah. And I think it's just really hard for us to let go and let God drive. I like it more when he's in the passenger seat or in the back seat and I'm driving than the other way around, because, we like to be in control over it.
Right.
And so we do have to get to a place where we let go and say, okay, God, I'm going to trust you. But my faith that you're going to do something for me still requires action on my part. I tell people all the time, you don't just sit on the couch and say, well, I have faith God's going to send me a job. And I'm just going to sit here and veg out and binge watch TV and eat every snack that I can. I still have a responsibility. But here's the part that becomes hard for us. We're used to controlling results. In this search process, you only control your efforts. You have absolutely no ability to make somebody have a job, number one. You can't make them interview you. You can't make them hire you. You have your efforts that certainly influence that, but you don't control it. And it really is one of the important mindset shifts that we need to get to, which is I can only control my efforts, and I just need to focus on my efforts. But in doing that, faith is a muscle. The more we exercise that, the better it's going to be. And so I often talk to people about making certain that their faith and trust isn't from the couch, but it's actively doing. But we have to not think that we still will earn it. That's still going to be God's decision as to when is the right time to make that opportunity free.
That's so good. You know what I've found in my own life is that seasons of waiting where I desire something, right? But I'm not there.
Right.
And so I'm being met with this perpetual disappointment, because I'm like, oh, I want this thing in the future. I want this thing to happen now. But my experience is falling short of those expectations or those desires. Often God is really showing me certain things about me that need to be chiseled and refined. It's like now I finally have the space to go, oh, there's some things I need to change about me. And those things, I imagine in a situation like this with job loss and trying to find a job, that those things that God is revealing to you that need to change might be the very things that are inhibiting you from getting that job that he wants you to have, right? Even just down to like people skills or emotional quotients or things that I'm sure in your experience in HR and in your experience of working with people who have found themselves in a job loss situation, you've probably encountered people who you look at and you're like, they're a little bit disillusioned. And this season is helping to show them what it's like to be on the other side of them, right? Can you, so if someone is in that seat, how do we get introspective in those seasons and go and get honest with ourselves about maybe the things about ourselves that are inhibiting us from being able to step into that next season?
Wow. Great question. I want to be careful, though, because one of the things that happens for people in job search is they're trying to pin down to what was it that caused them not to get the job. So therefore, when they interview and they don't get it, they want to call up the person and say, tell me what it was. Because if I know what it was, maybe I can debate you into seeing you're wrong and you'll rehire me. And that's why they never really get good feedback. So it's not one that we usually get an answer to. I usually try and help people understand that the right job may not be ready for you right now. Maybe something's going on, and we sometimes get so focused on a job
Yeah.
We forget that God just doesn't want a job. I think he wants a job for us that we can flourish in, that we can
Wow.
be successful in. And maybe we're not ready, or maybe that job isn't open. And
Hmm.
yet we're trying to do God's work by saying, well, this is the perfect job for me. And it may not be.
Hmm.
I've watched people take jobs that because they were in a rush, and 9 months later, they're out of work again.
Wow.
And other people looked and said, yeah, I knew that wasn't going to be a good fit for you. But they were so uncomfortable with not having a job
Hmm.
that they would take almost anything. I had a gentleman, Keith. I was having a cup of coffee with him, and he'd lost his job like 10 days prior. And we were sitting down in a Starbucks having this conversation, and he said, Dale, I can't do this. And I said, Keith, what do you mean? And he said, well, I can't take this. There's no responses to anything. It used to be when I sent an email, I got an answer. When I picked up the phone and called somebody, I got an answer. And, I call people about things. I send emails. I apply for jobs, and I don't hear anything. And he
Hmm.
said, I've got a job opportunity. It's not what I want, but I think I'm going to take it because I can't. So he couldn't handle the unknown. And he was ready to go, kind of like the children of Israel. He was ready to go back to Egypt because it was more
Yeah.
certain than it was to wait and see what God could open up for him. And I just tried to say to
Wow.
him, I said, Keith, you're 10 days into this. Brother, that radio silence is not unique to you. It happens to all of us.
Hmm.
And actually, it's been one of the things in my profession as a human resource executive that I would always talk to my staff about is we owe people answers on a timely basis. And even
Hmm.
if we don't have the answer, if we said we're going to give you an answer by Friday and we don't have an answer on Friday, at least call them on Friday and say, look, there's a holdup on the decision, and I don't have an answer for you. Giving people some communication is better than nothing.
Hmm.
And that's hard for people in this process. So
Yeah.
we have to the waiting. It's not easy. It's hard.
Yeah. Yeah.
In fact, when you are interviewing for a job, you spend what I'll call emotional capital. So let's
Hmm.
say you go from the screening interview to the first interview to the second interview, you start picturing yourself in that place.
Right.
And that's dangerous in a job search because you kind of stop looking.
Hmm.
And then all of a sudden, a month later, you find out they took somebody internally. They hired another candidate. Um, it's like a double whammy. It's like you lost a job again because you could see yourself there.
Yeah. Phew. Wow. Man, what a wrestling. What a wrestling.
Yeah, and
Just, ugh,
it's Davey, it's grief for a lot of people
that's,
also.
yes.
So if
Mhm.
you think about it, employee engagement is really defined as that emotional attachment to an organization that makes you give more than your employer's even
Mm,
paying you for. And
mm.
employers love that. But when all of a sudden then you say to somebody, thanks for the memories, you don't have a job,
Wow.
there's there's a feeling of rejection.
Yep.
Um, and people aren't certain what to do with that. And often it turns to anger.
Mm,
There's anger at maybe the person who said to you, you don't have a job. There's anger at the head of the organization,
yeah.
but they're really angry, and that's one of the real powerful emotions that actually keep people from moving forward. Because if
Yeah.
you're still angry, you're living in the past, and
Right.
somewhere you have to let go and just accept that no matter what, it happened to you. Now you got to
Yeah.
move forward, but dumping that anger is really hard.
Hmm.
And I always say to people when they're dealing with anger, and you can kind of see it on their face. I mean, I've told
Mm.
people I can't recommend you till you deal with your anger issue. Um, for some
Wow.
people, it's going to be just close the door in the house and shout it out. God's got
Yeah.
big ears and big shoulders. Um, but I always tell people when you're shouting and you're crying out in anger, don't edit your words. I
Mm,
mean, let it be real what's happening in you so that it can come out of you and you can give it over. Or
Yeah.
journaling is one of the best things for people. Take a journal and write for a couple of weeks just the thoughts that are going on in your heart and mind. I still have the journal somebody gave to me when I lost my first job. In fact, I use that to write some of the devotions because those raw emotions are in that journal. Or talk to a counselor, talk to your pastor, talk to a Christian counselor. But you need somebody that's going to help. You need somebody to listen, and that's either God, the piece of paper, or a counselor to get the anger out. And when you get the anger out, then you can start moving forward, and that becomes really important for people.
That's great. Dale, I'm so glad you mentioned that, because we're often talking to people about loss and grief. And it's I think, as we explain to people, hey, you're going to have to really lean into these difficult emotions. You're going to have to start externalizing these emotions to a safe community or a good counselor, or write it down or journal. Like this, cognitive behavioral therapy exercises, they're going to have to happen. People, it's very palatable for people when they think about it in terms of loss of a loved one, loss of a family member, loss of a friend. They can kind of recognize, yeah, well, of course, this is loss, and so I really am going to have to sort through this grief, But it's a lot more difficult for someone to palate the idea that, wait, job loss, this is grief too, and that I need to work through some of the same exercises as I would if I had lost a spouse or lost a sibling or lost a parent. Yeah, it is. Because to your point, a feeling buried never dies. It's going to ooze out of you, right?
Yeah, I always tell people it becomes the iceberg. The iceberg, the damage is really underneath the water, and it's going to come up and it's going to bite you at some point in time when you least expect it if you don't deal with it. So you have to get it out. But we don't like to even admit that we have those. Emotions are something that we aren't comfortable talking about.
Yeah.
And yet they're really powerful. I mean, there's a stat that says that over 80% of every decision you make in a day is emotional. So there's an emotion attached to all the decisions we make, and yet we like to think we're logical, and so we just say, oh, well, I'm skilled and talented, I'll be just fine, there'll be another job. Well, that works for a while till all of a sudden you don't have another job, and 3 months into it you start saying, hey, what's going on? Why don't I have that? And Davey, Satan really plays on people in this process. Satan has some lies that he tells us. He wants to put into your ear you're a failure.
Yeah.
He wants to put into your ear you're helpless in this process. And he wants to put in your ear you're unwanted. And those are lies that you can't listen to, but they're really easy to listen to when you're going through this process. As I said at the very beginning, the immediate reaction is I failed because I lost a job. It's an interesting thing that the COO actually told me. He said, Dale, I need to save money, and you make more money than the next person on your team, and you've developed a really good team, and your number 2 is really good. So I think I can be just fine without you.
Wow.
So that type of thing, will certainly happen, but it's easy to immediately feel like you're a failure.
Absolutely. All right.
And then the helplessness comes, put yourself in the shoes. You've probably got a listener out there who's lost a job and they haven't looked for a job in 20 years. And all of a sudden the world of a job search has changed. It's gone electronic.
Yep.
When they looked for a job, you filled out a piece of paper and you walked in and you talked to somebody at a reception desk, and maybe you got an interview and you had a chance to tell them all about it. Well, today it's electronic. So there's an algorithm, and that algorithm is determining whether your resume gets to the stack that the recruiter looks at. And they feel so helpless because this world has changed on them.
Yeah.
They're not quite certain what or how they're going to deal with something like that. How do I just don't feel like I have the tools to do the search. And the unwanted part comes because they don't get accepted for the job. I've had people that said, I'll have interview 1, I'll have interview 2, but I don't get the job. And at some point in time, no matter how skilled and gifted you are, you start to say, what's wrong with me?
Right. Right.
And so
Man.
we have to fight Satan in addition to job loss. That's he's in the process, man.
Yeah, there's a lot of obstacles and enemies in this whole process, and some of that is, how Satan plays on the inner me, right? I've heard it said that your inner me is your greatest enemy, because you begin to have all of this self-talk, and really the enemy's going to play on some of that self-talk, and it's going to creep into the most vulnerable aspects of who you are, the things you don't like about yourself the most, your cracks and stuff. And yet that's the very thing that God wants us to peer into during these seasons, so that we can shore up those cracks, so that we can become more like the image of Christ, right?
Right.
Let's talk about this, Dale. Let's talk about some of the other seats at the table. When you're experiencing this, there's other people that are also affected by this, your family, your spouse. What would you say to a spouse who's listening to this and they're going, yeah, my husband or yeah, my wife is spiraling right now because they've just received this news and I don't know what to do. How do I be there to support? How do I help? How do I encourage? How do I kick them in the tail if they need? Like, how am I supposed to respond?
Yeah. Well, so first of all, let's talk about those and make sure that everybody understands that if you're the spouse of somebody who's lost a job, this job loss process is going to have some of the same impact and the same emotions on you as it does on the person who lost the job. In some ways, I think it was harder on my wife because she wasn't actively engaged every day in trying to do something. She's in the other seat. So if you have fear and worry and anxiety about, the bills being paid, or gosh, are we going to lose the house? Are we going to have to move? Those sort of things.
Yeah.
Those emotions are really being impacted on the spouse and the kids too. And we often don't talk openly to our kids, and it kind of depends upon the ages, but there's an old expression, those little ears have big fears.
Yeah.
So I had a friend that went through a job loss, and
Wow.
when she had the new job, right before she landed it, she was having a conversation with her son, and he said, "Mom, are we going to lose the house?" And she said, "We were so far from anything like that," but he knew that Mom was out of work. He obviously had friends somewhere that had experienced it, and he was at a young enough age, he just took it further. So I think we owe it to family to have a conversation about it. And I kind of tell people it's important to talk about the expectations for what this job search means and what the person looking for the job will be doing. I have two quick stories. One friend that I met for a cup of coffee, and this was back in the early 2000s when you actually wore a suit and tie to work. I don't know if we're going to do that anymore.
Wait, you mean you don't wear a flat bill and a sweatshirt to work? Is that what you're trying to tell me, Dale?
Yep. And so I met him at a coffee shop, and he was in a suit. So we had our conversation about the job search and everything else. And I said, I see you're dressed up. Where are you going? You got a couple of appointments today? You got an interview? And he said, no. He says, my wife doesn't think I'm really working on a job search unless I dress up and leave the house like I used to when I worked. So I just come down here and have my breakfast and kind of do my stuff from here. One of the other things that's important for people to do in a job search is to network. So you want to meet as many people as you can to learn where job openings are, to gain some advocates. And one guy had faithfully been doing that for a period of time. And his wife one day said to him, when are you going to start looking for a job? All you do is have coffee with people. Now, the reality is he said, I realized at that point in time, I'd really never talked to her about what this job search looks like for someone in my position, and how I have to go about doing that. Now, he ultimately landed his job by having those cups of coffee that connected him to the right person that the job opened. And so I think expectations are important. That we talk about, what does this search mean? What am I trying to do? And here's how you can help. My wife was my best advocate. I was so blessed. Oh gosh, Davey, unbelievably blessed. But what mattered the most to me was when she praised my efforts.
Hmm.
So if you have a spouse who's out of work, when you praise their efforts, because that's all they control. Um, my wife would say, you get up every day and you go have those cups of coffee. And a lot of
Hmm.
them don't produce anything, but you faithfully get up and do that. And I'm so proud of you.
Wow.
Man, when your wife tells you that she's proud of you, what better thing could you hear from somebody? So for
Right.
a spouse, it's to support, but expectations become real important because then kind of we know what's going on and
Yeah.
we're talking about it. So
That's really good. You brought up this networking thing. I don't want to spend too much time on it, but it's so important because um, nowadays, you said, right, the whole landscape of job search has changed. Really, people are looking for people with a high EQ, not necessarily a high IQ. They're looking for people who can work with people.
right.
Those are the ones that become the most valuable in a position. And so networking is yeah, it's extremely important. But how do we do that without it seeming like a self-serving networking? Because I've certainly met people, Dale, who it's like they ooze this like weird, almost like shady kind of networking type vibe, and it's like you're really only seeking something for yourself, and yet at the same time, that's what you're doing. You're trying to find a job, right? But what does networking look from a kingdom perspective? How do we do that in terms of like adding value to people?
I look at networking as relationship building.
Mm,
And if you focus on building the relationship, everything else kind of comes after that. People are hesitant to do it because they say, well, they know I'm looking for a job. So
mm,
they're, you know, it's why am I going to go see them? They don't have a job and all that. And I always just say, you're trying to build a relationship with more people. And so the
yeah.
focus should be getting to know them, getting to know about their job. Yes, you'll have a chance to share about what you do, but it's that building the relationship that becomes really important. When people
Mm,
like you and you can build a relationship with them, you'd be amazed the number of people that will step up to the plate for you when they don't even know you.
wow.
And
Yeah.
but it comes from a relationship. And I think the mistake people make in networking is it's one and done. So you and I have a cup of coffee,
Mm,
and then I never hear from you again. And I always tell people you should update your network what's going on at least every 4 to 6 weeks.
hmm,
So I would send out an update to everybody in my network and just say, here's what's going on in the search. And
hmm,
it's really important because those people can still be your advocates. But if I've
hmm.
not heard from you in 2 months and I hear about a job, how hard am I going to work to go chase you down when you're not doing me the respect of keeping me informed of what's going
Yeah.
on?
Yeah.
So keep people involved, which might mean another cup of coffee. Just build a relationship and making that happen. In fact, in the back of my book, I actually have some appendices, and one is an example of my updates that I send
Mm.
because people are often not certain what to do, and so I put some ideas in the back of the book.
That's great. So practical. Man, that's so good. Is what you find in these seasons is God wants to do something really ethereal in you, right? Something very spiritual in you. But there's also some practical steps that we take in all of these seasons, and I think that's where we find that the convergence of that faith and and obedience, where those things come to a head.
And for networking, David, just the thing that I'll say to people is start with some people you know.
Mm.
Um,
Hmm.
it's a whole lot easier to have a cup of coffee and get reconnected with somebody you know, and
Yeah.
then let them help you with the introductions to some people you don't know, but get comfortable in the process, especially if you haven't done it. And it's going to be harder for some people. I'm an extrovert. Going to have cups of coffee was easy for me. For my wife, who's the introvert, it would be really hard. Um,
Yeah.
so,
Yeah. Wow. Okay. I've got two more questions. They're burning questions. So if you have the
all right.
time for this, Dale,
Yeah.
I want to talk about another seat at the table that I think you can provide some insight for, and that's the seat of the supervisor, the boss, the leader, the manager who is faced with this difficult situation of laying off staff, and assuming that they really do care for their team. That in and of itself is a pain. That's
Hmm.
a tough thing to sort through, those emotions. So I guess my question is twofold. How do you sort through if you're sitting in that seat on that side of the table? How do you sort through those emotions? Um, and how do you do it in a way that, to borrow a term that is certainly not used in corporate world oftentimes, but how do you do it in a way that shepherds people, right? That really cares about people.
Wow. Yeah, it is. It is really hard um, to say goodbye to someone, and there are a variety of reasons why we end up saying goodbye to someone.
Hmm.
Sometimes it's because they really aren't a good match for the job,
Yeah.
and sometimes as a leader, maybe we've let that go on longer than it should, and ultimately we need to deliver the message that says this isn't a good match for you.
Hmm.
I think honesty and candor is important in terms of helping them understand that it's not necessarily the right match and where the struggles are.
Yeah.
Um, Now, the hard part, Davey, is that first conversation you have can't go on for an hour and a half because it's going to be a debate. They're going to want to say
Mm.
all the reasons why they were a good match or this, that, or the other thing. Um, but you want to deliver the message, and then you want to also be willing to say, I'm here to help you.
Mm.
I'm here to help you with what's next. So you know, you might be able to refer them somewhere that there's a better match.
Mm.
Sometimes it's to be happy to speak on their behalf for someone else.
Yeah.
It's not easy,
Yeah.
and yet that's part of the job and leadership that we sometimes have to do. And if you do it in a caring way,
Hmm.
they're not going to necessarily say thank you, but they'll get it, and the people around it will get it. See, that's the other thing. When we say goodbye to people, everybody else is watching. They're watching
Yeah.
how we treat the person, um, how we handle the situation, because they're worried. Gosh, if something ever happens to me, how are you going to treat me?
Wow.
So how we do it and how we talk about it, I think, becomes really important because there's a message to everybody that's watching.
Wow. That's so good. Whew, so good. Okay, so obviously people are going to have to pick up this book. How long, oh Lord, how long? This devotional that you've written, um, because that's what's really going to help them dissect their emotions, untangle some of these things in terms of the identity that we have placed so much in our net worth, in our job, our occupation, our calling, whatever you want to call it, and untangle that and place our identity in who we are in Christ. This devotional is going to do such a great job of helping you walk through that journey. But I wonder if, to kind of close off this conversation, Dale, you can give us maybe just a summary, just like if you were to say, man, in that season, in that waiting season for me, the primary thing that God was doing in me was this. And this is why it was so beneficial for me in that season. Because I think sometimes we don't see the benefit, the redemptive nature of those waiting seasons. But you have a unique perspective in that you're looking back, right? Psalm 23 says that surely goodness and mercy will follow me all the days of my life. Well, following you means you got to look back and see that something's following you. And so you can attest to that. Man, goodness and mercy through that season was following me. What was that goodness and mercy? What was God doing in you during that season?
Boy, Davey, he did so many things for me, and I think one of the things that I learned was to slow down
Mm.
because I was that type A driven personality, and I am so prone to functioning toward success in things. So
Mm.
it slowed me down, reminded me of some of the things that were really more important in life.
Mm.
The other was to learn to trust in him because I learned in this process I just can't make it happen,
Yeah.
and so I kind of need to follow his lead
Yeah.
in the whole thing. And I love that you just used Psalm 23 because one of my favorite verses is early in the chapter, and it says, "He restores my soul." And when I got through the valley, that's what I felt like, is he restored my soul.
Yeah.
But it's not that bad things won't ever happen again, because again, I went through it again. And there are going to be a lot of people that are going to lose multiple jobs in their career, because that's just what happens in this country, that happens. So I went through the season again, and I took the learnings from the first and applied them to the second. But I had other challenges in the second one. What I would say, one other thing that we struggle with, Davey, is trying to find our relevance. When you're in the job search, I knew how I was relevant at work, but I didn't necessarily know how I was relevant in life. And it's a chance to learn about being relevant and still being a good husband, a good father, a good friend. That doesn't show up on a paycheck. But boy, it's so much more important in life. And it's a struggle that I had. Where's my relevance? I'm better at it today, but a lot of this stuff is just a continuing journey. It's not a destination.
Wow. Man, so challenging. I'm the same way, driven, type A, success-oriented, goal-oriented. And yet every night I'm doing the most important thing that I can be doing. And oftentimes my mind is preoccupied by the other things. I'm not fully present with my family, but every night when I tuck my kids into bed, when I have conversation with them, when we sit at the dinner table, when we do the dishes together, that's the most important moments of my life. And I appreciate you reminding me of that, Dale, and reminding all of us of that. This really galvanizes the priorities that we should have in our life in all these seasons. So thank you for spending time with us today. Thank you for your insight into this.
Yeah, Davey, I just appreciate your being willing to have the conversation about it, because as I said, the unemployed don't talk about it.
Yeah.
They keep it to themselves because of kind of the shame and embarrassment that they're feeling. And so for them, they're wondering, who's really going to be there to connect and help them. And too often people say, if you need any help in this job search, let me know. Well, they need people that are going to connect to them and stay connected through the journey, because somewhere along the line they need to let people know what's really going on.
Yeah.
They get really good at putting on that false facade that says, gee, I'm fine. And that happens in all sorts of grief. Yeah, I'm fine. I'm doing great. So I always say, ask them multiple times. No, I said, how are you really doing? I'm fine. How are you really doing? And that kind of signals to them, okay, you're really ready to hear the good, bad, and the other of what's going on. And so friends can be so important, and people will be disappointed by people they expect to step up to the plate that don't. And they will be amazed at people that come out of the woodwork to lend a hand that they never anticipated would be there for them.
Yeah, that's good.
It is unbelievable how God will use other people in your life, and the friendships you'll develop and the relationships that come through the process. Never easy when you're going through it, but unbelievable how it will happen.
Yeah. Wow. Well, Dale, how can we follow what you're doing? How can we tune in more to your work in your life?
So one of the things that I would ask, and it's not for me, it's for the people that are out there. One of the things, as I mentioned, people who are in the job search, they don't admit that they need help. So the interesting piece is I sell more books to people that are employed than people who are unemployed. So the unemployed person doesn't reach out, but people who are unemployed need something. And my book is a really gift to them to help them. And I need more people that are going to buy 4 or 5 copies of that book and have it in their desk drawer. And so when they hear of somebody that's unemployed, they're going to go have a cup of coffee with them and pass that book across the plate. I need pastors to have them in their desk drawer so that they are ready to do something more than just pray with people, because they're not going to ask for it. But
Yeah.
what I keep hearing from the people that have read it is you've validated everything that I was experiencing, but I couldn't put words around.
Yeah.
And the more important part is you've reminded me of where Jesus is in this process. And for some people, they'd forgotten that he's really there. And for some people, they didn't even know him. And so this is an opportunity to open a door to someone and let them know how Jesus can be with you, not just through this crisis in your life, because you'll consider it a crisis, but how you can go beyond that and let him be part of your life all the time.
Yeah, that's great. That's great. Well, we'll make sure that we put the resources in these show notes for those of you guys who are listening to this. If you're watching this on YouTube, How Long, O Lord, How Long? Devotions for the Unemployed and Those Who Love Them. So this is a great resource for everybody. Dale, thanks so much for spending time with us, for diving into this topic. This rich, rich conversation. We appreciate you taking the time.
Well, thanks again for being willing to tackle the conversation. If I can ever help, let's talk again.
Hey friend, if you liked this episode, be sure to like and subscribe so that you can stay in the loop every time Nothing is Wasted releases a piece of content here on this YouTube channel.